Hello, everybody, and welcome to this lecture. Today, we're going to be speaking about really two topics that occur concomitantly with one another, and that is that you see. Today, we're going to be talking about both foreign policy and domestic policy, and so we're going to be looking at one component known as American imperialism. And this idea of America or the United States as an imperialist nation, and imperialism is this notion that really larger countries, those who wield greater socioeconomic and political and military power, can gain control over other weaker nations. And there's this sense that the United States is not an empire and that we were not imperialistic, in the way that, say, Europeans were. But the reality is that at the turn of the 19th century, specifically, Americans became very imperialistic, and we began to wield our police power of the world, what Teddy Roosevelt would call the big stick diplomacy, right? Speak softly but carry a big stick. Use that big stick when you need to. Try and use diplomacy, but if it comes time to use the big stick, then use it. Well, the United States became imperialistic, and in some cases we were able to be diplomatic about the way we imperialized other nations, and in other areas, specifically with the Philippines, we were far more big stick in that we wielded that big stick. And so we're going to be talking about this imperialism. And then we're also going to then shift gears a bit and take a look at some domestic policies known as the progressive policies. And as I've mentioned before, the progressive era comes out of the Gilded Age. It is a time when people, again, like Teddy Roosevelt, will wage war against very large corporations to try and bust trusts and to try to break monopolies. It is a time where progressives are attempting to fix the ills and the evils of harsh labor conditions and child labor and try to bring some sense of fairness into the workplace. And here, during this time, you will see labor unions develop. You will begin to see minimum wage begin to put into place, regulated hours of time that you can work, that kind of thing. And so these are the two topics we're going to be looking at today. And we're going to start with American imperialism. And we're going to take a predominant look at the Spanish-American War, which will eventually lead to the war in the Philippines, known as the Philippine War, which is not really a conflict that you probably hear much about, but it's important to note that the United States did wield its influence militaristically against the Philippines in the latter part of the 19th century. And so that let us begin then with that. Again, just to remind you, I will be reading from time to time from a book called America, A Narrative History, written by George Brown Tyndall and David E. Shai. So with that, let's move forward. All right, it says, on the whole, the majority of people in the United States after the Civil War had what one congressman described as only a languid interest in foreign affairs. And what this essentially means is that most Americans were not concerned with foreign matters, right? They were concerned with domestic matters. And we've looked at a lot of these domestic issues, right? There's a whole South to be reconstructed. There's a new South being created, right? We've got a flux of immigration coming into the United States. There's mass westward migration, and we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but there's a lot of westward migration going on, a lot of industrialization going on. So there's much to do at home. And the progressives, as we will see later in this lecture, will also be moving on the domestic front. And so there's much to think about within the United States itself. And so the majority of Americans are not really focused on the periphery, on what's going on outside. Now, there are a few, and eventually, and some current scholarship actually makes this argument, and eventually the media is going to help broaden Americans' perspective on what it means to deal with foreign issues. And so while this historian is correct, yeah, they had only a languid interest, that interest will steadily increase. It says the development of industry and settlement into the western United States occupied the majority of people, while thoughts of imperialism and foreign issues were only minimally an issue for most. It was of minimal concern to most Americans. But as I've already mentioned, that minimal concern will eventually grow, and in part it grows due to the media, and we'll be talking a bit about that. It says, with all that stated, however, manifest destiny, and if you're not familiar with this term, manifest destiny was coined by John O'Sullivan in the early 1840s, and basically what this concept of manifest destiny implies is that there's this God-given right for Americans to overspread the American continent, to establish an American empire from sea to shining sea. Well, by the 1890s, as Frederick Jackson Turner would argue, the frontier was closed. We had reached the entire continent. The United States had overspread the continent, and that was true. Okay? That stated, the idea of manifest destiny didn't go away, and even though there wasn't any continental land left for the United States to expand into, there were foreign territories. And so it says here, manifest destiny had not disappeared, and there were a few very focal and influential people who championed the idea of territorial acquisition, who championed the idea of American imperialism. Two of the most important of these individuals is future President Teddy Roosevelt and an individual known as Alfred T. Mahan. And we're going to be talking about both of these individuals. All right, moving forward. Now, who exactly is pushing for American imperialism, right? Who wants to see the United States spread outside the continent itself? Because as you now know, we have 50 states. 2 of those are outside the American continent, Alaska and Hawaii. We also have Puerto Rico, which is in many respects an important territory for the United States. And up until the current history, we had access to the Philippines and Guam, and of course, the United States has significant economic influence in both Canada and specifically in Latin America. And the question is, where did all that come from? And so many different groups during the latter part of the 19th century begin to push for American expansion. It says industrialists, on one account, they wanted new markets, right? They wanted to be able to sell their commodities to foreign nations in a much larger scale. And so the idea is that if we push towards imperialism and we gain a foothold in these other nations, then we will have new markets to sell our goods to. We will also have access to resources in those countries. For example, in Cuba, sugar was a major commodity, and in fact, the United States had significant foothold in the Cuban sugar trade. And so this is again an example of some of the reasons why you might want to see the United States imperialize other nations, simply because it's good for business. Okay? Nationalists. Nationalists are individuals who are extremely patriotic. It's pro-America kind of thing, right? And how do you show off that you're a great nation, right? Well, part of the way that you do that is you increase the size of your nation. It says nationalists claim that colonies were a hallmark of national prestige. The European powers had already claimed much of the globe, and America would now have to compete with that, or they would perish in the wake of being overdone by these other European nations. And so nationalists begin to argue that the United States needs to grow. Okay, missionaries continually preach to spread the message of faith, Christianity, largely to other nations. In fact, our actions in the Philippines will largely be under the guise, or will in part be the guise of, we need to lift the Filipino, what McKinley, the President of the United States, will call the little brown brother, quote unquote, right? That we need to lift them out of their despond, and we need to bring civilization and culture to them, and we're going to do that by bringing Jesus to them. Right? And so that's one of the arguments. You have social Darwinists, such as Josiah Strong. We've mentioned him before. Social Darwinists believe that American civilization was superior to others, and that it was America's duty to diffuse it to other people. Right? We as Americans have this gift that we can share with the world. Right? A superior culture, and we need to give this superior culture to these other people. Right? And then you also have men like Alfred Thayer Mahan, or Alfred T. Mahan, who wrote an influential thesis declaring that throughout history, those who controlled the seas controlled the world. And therefore, for Alfred T. Mahan, he's going to say, look, the United States needs to control the waters of the world, and therefore we need to have a strong navy, right? He publishes this idea in something known as The Influence of Sea Power upon history, 1660 through 1783, where basically he's trying to demonstrate that the great powers of the world have always had strong navies. They've always been quasi-militaristic, if not explicitly so, right? And so the United States, in this vein, if they want to be great, they need to follow in suit. And so for these reasons, and others, but I've just thrown a smattering of them out here for you, for these reasons, you're going to see a greater push towards American imperialism, right? There are also some other reasons, and I will get to them here in a second, why Americans as a whole might have begun to latch themselves onto this idea of moving into foreign nations. And specifically, I'm referring to Cuba and Spain with the Spanish-American War, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, okay? All right, so let's move forward. Okay, so it goes on to say that before 1890, American lands consisted of little more than the continental states and Alaska. Alaska was purchased, I believe it was in the 1870s, 1880s, something like that. But it says that by the end of World War I, which ends in 1918, peace settlement comes in 1919. We'll talk about that later. But by the end of World War I, America could boast a global empire. Hawaii, for example, was added in the 1890s by force. For those of you who do not know, Hawaii, of course, at one time was a monarchy, and the United States effectively went in and deposed the Queen. Queen Lulukalani deposed her, she lost authority, and the United States essentially bought and took control over Hawaii. It is a unique culture in and of itself, quite different than the Anglo culture on the continent, if you've ever been to Hawaii, right? And so this is one example of where you can see the United States acquiring territories, not necessarily via diplomacy, albeit that was part of it, but to some degree via force. Another example would be the Spanish-American War, which brought the United States influence into Guam, Puerto Rico, and predominantly the Philippines. And it is a solid argument to say that the reason why we went to war with Spain in 1898 was so that we could acquire the Philippines. Okay? It says the Roosevelt Corollary would also be brought in to the Monroe Doctrine. And if you're not familiar with the Monroe Doctrine, you might want to take a look at that particular document, but it was passed during James Monroe's presidency, where basically the United States told Europeans to leave the American hemisphere alone. They could not colonize the American hemisphere, and should they attempt to do so, the United States would view it as an act of aggression and they would go to war, and vice versa, the United States would remain out of European affairs. Roosevelt's going to add some material to this doctrine, which effectively, in my opinion, destroyed the Monroe Doctrine and basically allowed the United States to become a police power of the world under the guise of we're protecting American hemisphere from other people. But essentially the Roosevelt Corollary declared the entire Western Hemisphere an American sphere of influence. In other words, Latin America, Canada, and others, right, this was an American sphere of influence that the United States could intervene in should they see it necessary. Okay? It says, through initial negotiation and eventual intimidation, the United States also secured the rights to build and operate a canal in Panama, which it held control over for many, 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 many years and did not release control over it to Panama until the latter part of the 20th century. Okay, so that is sort of a mini paragraph of some of the things that the United States did, which evidences its imperialism. Okay, it says the country that had once fought to throw off imperial shackles was now itself an empire. With the economic and strategic benefits came the expected difficulties. Filipinos fought a bloody struggle for independence, but America became entangled with distant conflicts to defend the new claim. It says, regardless of the nobility or self-interest of the intent, the United States was now poised to claim its role as a world power in the 20th century. And that world dominance would basically be solidified after World War I. Okay? And so the strength of the United States is sort of this world domineering power which we are today, and perhaps why so many nations around the world really don't like Americans. Part of that is, much of that in fact, is rooted here in this imperialistic move that occurs in the latter part of the 20th century. Okay. All right, let's move on. Okay, so with that all stated, let's now jump into examples of American imperialism. And I've already mentioned this particular example, but let's go in more detail. And that, of course, is the acquisition of Alaska, what became known as Seward's Icebox or Seward's Folly, so called because William Seward is the individual who proposed to purchase the territory. It says here, Manifest Destiny did not die when Americans successfully laid claim to the West Coast. It says the newly won territory was the source of heated argument in the 1850s and a major reason for the war between the states. And I would go on to say that's true. Westward expansion was incredibly significant towards the American Civil War. It says once the Union was patched back together, albeit with some holes I would suggest, Americans were mostly content with settling the land already under the United States flag. It says, but as the decades passed and America grew strong with industrial might, the desire to spread the eagle's wings, if you will, over additional territory came back into vogue. Between 1890 and the start of World War I, the United States earned a seat at the table of imperial power, and that begins in part with the acquisition of Alaska. It says when William Seward proposed the purchase of Alaska in 1867, his peers thought he had gone insane. Russian America, it was called, was a vast frozen wasteland, surely not worth $7.2 million that Seward wanted to pay for it. Seward's folly, some scoffed. Seward's icebox, others stated. The Senate saw the potential of its vast natural resources and approved a treaty to purchase Alaska, however. And of course we know today Alaska has quite a bit of natural resources, aka oil, that the United States could and sometimes taps into, right? And so Seward saw something in Alaska that others didn't. Other people just saw ice and Eskimos, right? Why would we want this particular place, right? But Seward and Congress saw something important here, something that could benefit the United States via natural resources. It says the Senate approved the treaty, but the House stalled the purchase of what they called the Polar Bear Garden for over a year. It says not too much attention was paid to the new acquisition at first. Americans were simply too busy mending the fractured Union and then moving west to settle the territory. But nonetheless, Alaska became the 49th state of the United States. And what I want you to do is to just go ahead and click on that thing that says film, and there's a little film there that will go over this purchase of Alaska. But this is sort of an example of how this imperialism worked, right? There is a desire for some commodity that Alaska could provide to the United States, and so in this case we used diplomacy and we purchased the territory. We didn't have to go in with the big stick, but again, it's this idea that the United States is going to justify acquiring territories outside of the U.S. continent for its own benefit, not necessarily to the benefit of those who are already in the territory. Okay, so go ahead and watch that film and then move on. Okay, I hope you liked that little fun film there. Interesting music, if you will. But let's move on to another state, in fact the last state to be added to our union, and that would be Hawaii. It says, by the time the United States got serious about looking beyond its own borders to conquer new lands, much of the world had already been claimed by other people. It says only a few distant territories in Africa and Asia and remote islands in the Pacific remained free from imperial grasp. It says Hawaii was one such plum. Led by a hereditary monarch, the inhabitants of the kingdom prevailed as an independent state. Okay? And this is an interesting thing to think about, because in many respects what the United States does in Hawaii is it violates its own virtues of independence, right? The United States in 1776 declares its independence from Great Britain, and it strives to become its own nation, right? And we would not sit back and allow another country to come in and violate that. And yet here, what we are doing is attempting, both diplomatically and other ways, to acquire Alaska, but it's its own independent state, run by its own government. It says American expansionists looked with greed on the strategically located islands and waited patiently to plan their move. I know it sounds a little sinister, right? It says interest in Hawaii began in America as early as the 1820s, when New England missionaries tried in earnest to spread their faith. It says since the 1840s, keeping European powers out of Hawaii became a principal foreign policy for the United States. Americans acquired a true foothold in Hawaii as a result of the sugar trade. Now, the sugar trade is eventually going to shift into what is Cuba, right? One of the main reasons why we will go to war against Spain for Cuban independence is because of the sugar trade in Cuba. But at this point, it's also important for the United States to be paying attention to Hawaii for those reasons as well. Goes on to state that the U.S. government provided generous terms to Hawaiian sugar growers, and after the Civil War, profits began to grow. A turning point in U.S.-Hawaiian relations occurred in 1890 when Congress approved something known as the McKinley Tariff. Now, what did the McKinley Tariff do? This tariff raised import rates on foreign sugar. Now, think about this for a second. Hawaii is an area where we are gaining sugar from. Okay? The McKinley Tariff increases the rate that it costs to bring sugar into the United States from Hawaii. So, how do you correct this? Well, there's two ways you can correct this. Well, there's multiple ways you could correct this. Two that I'm going to mention. One, you could get rid of the tariff. Or two, if Hawaii just happened to be part of the United States, if it was the 50th state, it would no longer fall victim to the McKinley Tariff, and they would not be a problem anymore. So in many respects, the McKinley Tariff is passed as a maneuver. It's strategic in order to place economic pressure against Hawaii to get people in that nation prepared to come and desirous to come into the United States as a state. Okay? It says Hawaiian sugar planters were now being undersold in the American market, and as a result, a depression swept the islands. The sugar growers, mostly white Americans, knew that if Hawaii were to be annexed by the U.S., the tariff problem would naturally disappear. At the same time, the Hawaiian throne was passed to Queen Lulukalani, who I will show you a picture of here in a second, who determined that the root of Hawaii's problems was foreign interference. And basically, this is not an uncommon thing that happens in many nations that are being imperialized, right? In fact, you see this in China when Great Britain sought to come in and they were selling opium to China, and the Empress decided that she didn't want opium from England anymore, and England goes to war against China and wins, right? Well, that's what happens here. What we have is Queen Lulukalani says, the problem that Hawaii is facing is the United States interference, right? I mean, she's not stupid. And so this great showdown sort of begins. It begins to unfold, and the loser will be Hawaii, right? As far as an independent nation state is concerned, and they get annexed and eventually made into a state by the United States. And I believe it becomes a state in the 1950s, but you might want to check that date. Alright, this is just an image of Queen Lulukalani, just to give you an idea here of who she is. So that's all. Feel free to take a look at her as much as you like, and we're going to move on. Alright, so how did this happen? It says in January 1893, the sugar planters staged an uprising to overthrow the Queen. It says at the same time, they appealed to the United States Armed Forces for protection. It says, without presidential approval, Marines stormed the islands, and the American minister to the islands raised the stars and stripes in Honolulu. Okay? This is a coup, if you will, over the Hawaiian government. It says the Queen was forced to abdicate, and the matter was left for Washington politicians to deal with. It says by this time, Grover Cleveland had been inaugurated president. Cleveland was an outspoken anti-imperialists and thought Americans had acted shamefully. So he withdrew the annexation treaty from the Senate and ordered an investigation into potential wrongdoings. So in my opinion, Grover Cleveland does something well here, right? There was wrongdoing done. It says Cleveland aimed to restore Liliuokalani to her throne, but American public sentiment favored annexation. And so there's a lot of public pushback against this. It says the matter was prolonged until Cleveland left office. It says when war broke out with Spain in 1898, the military significance of Hawaiian naval bases as a way station to the Spanish Philippines outweighed all other considerations. In other words, by the time the Spanish-American War arrives, Hawaii is far too valuable because it provides a launching point for the United States to send military personnel and commodities into the Philippines. And so it doesn't matter anymore. That's what we need to have. We need Hawaii, so we need to take it. It says President McKinley signed a joint resolution annexing the islands, much like the manner in which Texas joined the Union in 1845. It says Hawaii remained a territory until granted statehood in 1959. And it says here in my handy-dandy book, it says, when McKinley became president in 1897, he was looking for an excuse to annex the Hawaiian Islands. Quote, "We need Hawaii," he said, "just as much and a good deal more than we did California. It is manifest destiny." It says this excuse was found when the Japanese, also hoping to take over the islands, sent warships to Hawaii. McKinley responded by sending American ships and asked the Senate to approve a treaty to annex Hawaii. When the Senate could not muster the two-thirds majority needed to approve the treaty, McKinley used a joint resolution of the House and Senate to achieve his purposes. The resolution passed by simple majorities in both houses, and Hawaii was annexed in the summer of 1898. Okay? And so this should give you some sense of the ways that the United States goes about engaging in imperialism, right? On some cases, it's very diplomatic, and in other cases, it's a little bit less so. It's a little bit cutthroat, okay? And Alaska and Hawaii are just two examples, right? The greatest example, in my opinion, of American imperialism comes with what we're going to deal with next, and that is the Spanish-American War. Okay, the Spanish-American War, which will be immediately followed by the Philippine War. It says, there was more than one way to acquire more territory. If the globe had already been claimed by imperial powers, the United States could always seize lands that other people held. It says Americans were feeling proud of their growing industrial and military prowess. It says the long dormant Monroe Doctrine could finally now be enforced. Good sense suggested that when treading on the toes of empires, America should start small. In 1898, that's what the United States did. In 1898, Spain, which had once been a massive imperial power, was weak, and Americans knew it. And so they are going to pounce, and they are going to go to war against Spain under the guise of freeing Cuba from Spanish control. And the reality is, as I believe, and there's a whole bunch of history and evidence to support this, but I'm convinced that William McKinley, who's president during this time, was an imperialist. This was a man who wanted control and access over the Philippines, which Spain had held control over. And so in order to gain access to those territories, we went to war with Spain under the pretense that we wanted to gain Cuban liberation, Cuba Libre. There is discussion as to whether or not William McKinley always intended to have access over the Philippines, whether or not the United States always intended for imperialism. My answer to that is yes, I do believe we always intended to imperialize the Philippines, but we weren't necessarily going to make that statement right up front. It says Cuba became the nexus of Spanish-American tensions. Since 1895, Cubans had been in open revolt against Spanish rule. The following year, in 1896, Spain sent General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba in order to halt the rebels. Now, in U.S. history, General Valeriano Weyler is considered a villain, an evil villain, right? Much of that has to do I believe, with the media portrayal of Valeriano Weyler. And there is a wonderful book written by Bonnie M. Miller called From Liberation to Conquest, The Visual and Popular Cultures of the Spanish-American War of 1898. And in that work, she's essentially arguing that the media did much to focus and refocus and delineate the way in which the war against Spain was understood by most Americans by the cartoons that were created and the films and what have you. And I don't say this as an apologist to Valeriano Weyler. It's just simply we have to understand that the traditional story says that Valeriano Weyler, and I give you a little bit of that story here, but Valeriano Weyler was a man who put people into concentration camps and didn't feed them, and it was horrific. And you know, some of that is true, but the press had a way of manipulating these stories or making them bigger than they were. Now, we don't necessarily want to put all of this on the press, but I think a part of that has to be taken in consideration. It says here, anyone suspected of supporting independence would have been removed from the general population and sent to concentration camps. And that is not inherently inaccurate, but again, there's two parts to this story. It says, although few were summarily executed, conditions at the camps led over 200,000 to die of disease and malnutrition. And the reality is that many people died of disease. Okay, the Spanish-American War, as the Secretary of State Hayes would call it, was the splendid little war. The thing lasted about 3 months, and the majority of people who died, and by people I mean Americans, the majority of Americans rather who died in this particular war died of disease. And so the conditions there were pretty nasty. In fact, the American government did not prepare American soldiers for the diseases that they would encounter when they got to Cuba, when they got to Spain or wherever they were going, right? They didn't tell them that people were dying of diseases, and then they died. Okay, so yeah, people are dying of disease. Not necessarily because of what Weyler is doing, albeit he's not the nicest dude in the world, right? But because those are the conditions of the environment. It says the news reached the American mainland through the newspapers of the yellow journalists, as well as many others. And in fact, and this is a recent change in my thinking about the Spanish-American War, but this book, From Liberation to Conquest, makes it very clear that it wasn't just the yellow journalists, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it wasn't just the yellow journalists who did this, right? The yellow journalists would be comparable to things like the National Enquirer today. They were headed by two very prominent men. One was named William Randolph Hearst, and the other Joseph Pulitzer. These were the two most prominent yellow publishers, and in many respects they sensationalized the news, right? There's this mythical statement that William Randolph Hearst is allegedly reported to have said, where Hearst sends a reporter to Cuba to talk about to send images and talk about the war that's supposedly unraveling in Cuba, and he writes back to Hearst and says, there's nothing going on, it's all quiet here. And allegedly Hearst is reported to have said, you manufacture the pictures and I'll manufacture the war, right? That never actually happened, as far as I understand it, but it's this idea that the yellow journalists were able to create the Spanish-American War. Okay, now what is yellow journalism? Go ahead and click on the word appalled there, and you'll be able to see what that is, and then we'll move forward. Okay, so essentially what happens is, through a series of various events, whether they were through the yellow journalists, whether they were through cartoons, what have you, Americans become far more willing to support the Spanish-American War. And basically what many of the cartoons are going to do is they're going to pitch the war as what we call Cuba Libre. This idea that Cuba needs to be saved by a savior. It's being attacked by the evil Spaniard. And part of that comes from a couple of important events. It says in February 1898, relations between the United States and Spain deteriorated even further. Dupuy de Lome, who was the Spanish minister to the United States, had written a stinging letter about President McKinley to a personal friend. It says the letter was intercepted and it found itself on the desk of William Randolph Hearst, who then published it on February 9th. And essentially the de Lome letter is one where, you've got de Lome basically calling McKinley a wimp. He's calling out the president. He's not saying very kind things about the United States, and this really pushes McKinley further and further towards wanting to declare war. And then, on the evening of February 15th, there is a American battleship known as the Maine, and it explodes in the Havana harbor. And essentially what happens is you immediately get people like Hearst and Teddy Roosevelt saying the Spanish blew the Maine up, we need to remember the Maine, right? It becomes sort of like remember the Alamo, or it becomes a battle cry, and it becomes sensationalized within American newspapers to the point where essentially Americans come to the point of view, and in large part, that Cuba needs to be saved, right? They need to be saved. Cuba Libre, okay? And, that is very persuasive for many people. And so what happens is the United States is going to go to war. It says here on April 11th, 1898, McKinley asked the Congress for permission to use force in Cuba, right? And part of this is, again, to free Cuba from Spanish tyranny. Underneath all of this, I believe, is the desire for the United States to annex the Philippines. And I think that is proved by the fact that once the Spanish-American War is over, the U.S. will wage a war against the Philippines, a much longer war, years as opposed to months. Okay? It says, to send a message to the rest of the world that the United States was interested in Cuban independence, allegedly we were interested in Cuban independence, as instead of American colonization, Congress passed something known as the Teller Amendment to this declaration of war. Okay, and the Teller Amendment basically promised that America would not annex the island of Cuba, right? And this, in fact, I think is strategic, right? We want to prove to the rest of the world that our interest in Cuba is for Cuba and not the United States. We have no intention to annex Cuba, and I don't think the United States ever had a desire to annex Cuba, at this point at least. What they wanted was the Philippines. And so the Teller Amendment is this way of sort of negotiating yourself and appeasing and calming the fears of those who say the only reason why the United States is going to war with Spain is in order to annex Cuba, in order to get a foothold in the Cuban sugar industry, right, which the United States already had significant trade with Cuba in their sugar industry at this point. And the Teller Amendment says, no, that's not our intention, right? But underneath that, we're also thinking our intention is the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, these other territories, which the United States will acquire once the war comes to an end. Okay? It says, after that Teller Amendment conscious clearing measure, American leaders threw caution to the wind and declared open warfare on the Spanish throne. And what I want you to do is just to go ahead and click on this film here on the word throne, and it will take you through a 7-minute basic overview of the Spanish-American War itself. Again, a 3-month little war, the splendid little war, as Hayes called it, and then we will move forward. All right, so go ahead and click on that. Okay, so that should have been hopefully somewhat enlightening to you. It basically covers, the gist of it. It says the Treaty of Paris, which ends the Spanish-American War, and again, hopefully you watched that film. This Treaty of Paris was most generous to the winners, which would have been the United States. It says the U.S. received the Philippines and the islands of Guam and Puerto Rico. Cuba became independent, and Spain was awarded $20 million for its losses. It says the treaty prompted a heated debate in the United States, however. Anti-imperialists called the U.S. hypocritical for condemning European empires while pursuing one of its own. They argued that the war was Cuba Libre. The war was supposed to be about freeing Cuba, not seizing the Philippines. It says criticism increased when Filipino rebels led by Emilio Aguinaldo waged a 3-year insurrection against their new American colonizers. All right, following the Spanish-American War was the Philippine-American War, led by Emilio Aguinaldo. And it's interesting because during the Spanish-American War, Emilio Aguinaldo is an ally to the United States. And if you take a look at cartoons, newspaper accounts of Emilio Aguinaldo during the Spanish-American War, he is portrayed as a sort of white individual, as very clean-cut, very civilized. But when the Philippine War begins, and he's leading that against the United States, he begins to be portrayed in darker skin, which was not uncommon during most American cartoonists during the Spanish-American War. In order to sort of demonize and sort of make seem more sinister, they always portrayed people in darker skin. And there's a whole historical context that goes behind that for the United States, one I obviously don't have time to get into now. But it's interesting to see how the United States shifts in their depiction of Emilio Aguinaldo. But it's also important to recognize that why would the United States wage a 3-year war against the Philippines if it was never their intention to acquire the Philippines to begin with? The only answer to that is that the United States always intended to acquire the Philippines. They fought a 3-month war to fight a 3-year war in order to acquire the territory they actually wanted. It says, while the Spanish-American War lasted 10 weeks and resulted in 400 battle deaths, the Philippine-American War lasted nearly 3 years and claimed 4,000 American lives. It says, nevertheless, President McKinley's expansionist policies were supported by the American public, who seemed more than willing to accept the blessings and curses of their new expanding empire. And my book says, at such a cost, the United States was launched onto the world scene as a great power, with all the benefits and burdens of a new colonial power, right? And so yet again, what we find here is American imperialism sort of run amok, okay? And the Spanish-American War is a very important example of the way that Americans and pro-imperialists used both diplomacy and violence to acquire their objectives. All right, let's move on. Okay, moving forward with America's imperialism, war was not the only way to go about achieving one's imperialistic ambitions. And I've mentioned this already before, but there was this policy that Theodore Roosevelt forwarded known as big stick diplomacy. And part of the big stick diplomacy was related to a foreign policy which I mentioned earlier known as the Monroe Doctrine. And effectively the Monroe Doctrine again stipulated that the United States in the early 19th century said that the Americas should no longer be considered a hemisphere for colonization, and Europe will be a place that the United States will not interfere with either. Under Theodore Roosevelt, he adds to the Monroe Doctrine something called the Roosevelt Corollary. Again, we mentioned this, and essentially he broadens the scope of the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially allows for the United States to view the American hemisphere as essentially a place where the United States could act as sort of a policeman, right, in order to ensure the preservation of America for Americans. The United States could now extend the Monroe Doctrine in that they could police various areas that potentially may be threatened. And as it says here, for many years, the Monroe Doctrine was practically a dead letter. The bold proclamation of 1823 that declared the Western Hemisphere forever free from European expansion bemused the imperial powers, who knew that the United States was simply too weak to enforce its claim. And in 1823, the reality is that the United States was too weak to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. But that had changed by the turn of the century. It says by 1900, the situation had changed. A bold, expanding America was spreading its wings, daring the old world order to challenge its newfound might. When TR became president, he decided to reassert Monroe's old declaration. And he's going to do this by forwarding his own sort of declaration known as the Roosevelt Corollary. It says here, convinced as he was that all of Latin America was vulnerable to European attack, Roosevelt dusted off the Monroe Doctrine and added his own corollary. It says, while the Monroe Doctrine blocked further expansion of Europe in the Western Hemisphere, the Roosevelt Corollary went one step further, and it basically stated that should any Latin American nation engage in chronic wrongdoing, a phrase that included large debts or civil unrest, then the United States military would intervene. Basically, as I interpret this, and you might think of it differently, but in my opinion, the Roosevelt Corollary essentially gave the United States permission, and in effect the U.S. gave itself this permission, to interfere and intervene in areas of Latin America because the United States may define the area as engaged in a chronic wrongdoing. This opens the sphere of influence significantly for the United States. In doing this, the United States did not have to, send troops into this region. They didn't have to fight a war in order to gain a foothold into the area. They don't even have to colonize the area. What they have via the Roosevelt Corollary is the ability to interfere and meddle with and intervene in the life of Latin Americans whenever they deem fit. It says Europe was to remain across the Atlantic, while America would police the Western Hemisphere. The first opportunity to enforce this new policy came in 1905, when the Dominican Republic was in jeopardy of invasion by European debt collectors. The United States invaded the island nation, seized its custom houses, and ruled the Dominican Republic as a protectorate until the situation was stabilized. And so you can see here, the Roosevelt Corollary provided the United States a measure of control over other people's affairs that we may argue today, and you may define it this way, that this is really an abuse of power, right? At least that's how I define it, okay? And so this is, again, another example of American imperialism. You don't have to actually have a physical presence in the area that you're controlling. You could do it this way, right? And so this is one example of that, this big stick diplomacy, okay? Let's move on. It goes on to state that the effects of the new policy were enormous. Teddy Roosevelt had a motto, and his motto was, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." It says to Roosevelt, the big stick was the new American Navy, right? And if we recall back to Alfred T. Mahan, his argument was that great nations have strong, large navies, right? And so the United States is going to do that. And that also makes sense because TR at one point was the Undersecretary of the Navy. So, there's this connection there. It goes on to state that by remaining firm in resolve and possessing the naval might to back its interests, the United States could simultaneously defend its territory and avoid war. Latin Americans did not look upon the corollary favorably, and of course they wouldn't, right? Because effectively what this did was it allowed for the United States, again, to exert a measure of control over their lives without their consent. It goes on to state that they resented U.S. involvement and animosity against their large neighbor to the north grew dramatically. By the end of the 20th century, the United States would send troops of invasion to Latin America over 35 times, establishing an undisputed sphere of influence throughout the hemisphere. And if we go to my handy-dandy notebook here, Mr. Tyndall writes, more than any other American of his time, Theodore Roosevelt helped transform the role of the United States in world affairs. The country had emerged from the Spanish-American War a world power, and he insisted that this entailed major new responsibilities. To ensure that his country accepted this international obligation, Roosevelt stretched both the Constitution and executive power to the limit. In the process, he pushed a reluctant nation onto the center stage of world affairs. Okay? And so big stick diplomacy, the Spanish-American War, the acquisition of Hawaii and Alaska, these are all examples of American imperialism at the turn of the century. It evidences the fact that Manifest Destiny was not dead. It simply moved beyond the continent. Okay? One final example I want to give to you is the United States interaction with the Panama Canal. The canal actually was begun by the French, and they were unable to complete it, and Teddy Roosevelt picked up the remains and was able to wield a significant amount of influence in the area of Panama via the construction of the canal. So go ahead and click on that, watch that short film, and then we're going to move on to a different discourse, a different discussion. But the point of all of this is simply to make clear that at the turn of the century, the United States is not simply just concerned with domestic policies, right? We are also concerned with foreign policy, and that foreign policy oftentimes took the stage as imperialism. So, again, watch that film, and then we'll move on to something new and different. Okay, let's now move from American imperialism to the progressive era, the progressive movement. Progressive movement is, as the title itself sort of suggests, it is a time in American history when certain individuals, again specifically Teddy Roosevelt, are going to try and be progressive in their thinking, and largely this progressive movement will attempt to destroy the power of big business. It will seek to attack monopolies held by many of these big businesses. It will try to increase the size and scope of government participation. Remember that during the Gilded Age, the government itself was kind of lackadaisical. It was laissez-faire. Well, progressive politicians were far more hands-on, and they wanted to see much greater government intervention. Progressives will also attack social ills, such as labor conditions. And so we're going to be taking a look at some of this now. It says America in 1900 looked nothing like America in 1850. Yet those in power seem to be applying the same old strategies to complicated new problems. The populists had tried to effect change by capturing the government. The progressives would succeed, however, where the populists had failed. It goes on to state that the progressives were urban. Okay, they were not rural. They came from the Northeast. They were educated. They generally came from the middle or upper classes. Protestant reform-minded men and women. It says there was no official progressive party until 1912, but progressivism itself had already swept the nation. And there are a number of progressive presidents that the United States will have. The two most outspoken, I would argue, would have been Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and some will argue that the progressive president also could be seen or found in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, albeit he's dealing with some different situations, and we'll get to him later. Okay, it goes on to state here that it was more of a movement than a political party. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson didn't describe themselves as being of the Progressive Party, but they were both progressives in their thinking. Hence, we call it a movement. Okay, and it says, and there were adherents to the philosophy in both parties. It says there were three progressive presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, who succeeded Teddy Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson. It says Roosevelt and Taft were Republicans and Wilson was a Democrat. What united the movement was a belief that the laissez-faire social Darwinist outlook of the Gilded Age was morally and intellectually wrong. Okay? And so one could easily understand the progressive movement as an outgrowth of the Gilded Age, right? The problems that progressives saw of the Gilded Age is what motivated them. Okay? It goes on to state that progressives believed that people and government had the power to correct abuses produced by nature and by free market capitalism, right? So the abuses and the corruption fostered and harnessed by, business gone amok, the progressives believed that, the government can correct these problems. They can correct these ills. They can correct labor problems and child labor and poor working conditions, right? And so that's what they're going to try and do. All right, let's move on. Goes on to state here that the results were astonishing. Seemingly every aspect of society was touched by progressive reform. Worker and consumer issues were addressed. Conservation of natural resources was initiated. And in fact, you can thank Teddy Roosevelt for having many of the national parks that currently are in operation today, right? There was this sense that if mankind continued to grow and develop industrially the way they were, then there would be nothing left for posterity. And so one of the movements of the progressives was to set aside large tracts of land to preserve them for posterity. And so we have those today, right? It goes on to state that progressives also sought to deal with the plight of the urban poor, right? Goes on to state that national political movements such as temperance and women's suffrage found allies in the progressive movement. And it's not surprising that women gained the right to vote during the progressive era. It is not surprising that prohibition of alcohol will come onto onto center stage during the progressive movement. Okay, the era produced a host of national and state regulations, plus 4 amendments to the Constitution. It says when the United States became involved in the First World War, Woodrow Wilson, again one of our progressive presidents, he's president at the time. So when the United States became involved in the First World War, attention was diverted from domestic issues and progressivism went into decline. While unable to solve the problems of every American, the progressive era set the stage for the 20th century trend of an activist government trying to assist the people. Progressives basically believed that it was the role of the government to provide help. And this is why, and when we get to Franklin Roosevelt, he's going to be seen as a progressive, because during the Great Depression, right, the New Deal policies of the Roosevelt administration are seeking to help the general American, right? And so he's seen as progressive in that way. But if it is your contention that the government's too large today, part of that stems from this progressive movement where, you know, there's sort of the pendulum moved all the way to one side during the Gilded Age, and it swung back to the other side during the progressive movement, and put into place this sort of idea that the government could have more of an active role, and that government could be the federal, state, or local governments in your life and in regulating what goes on. So this is sort of a general introduction to the progressive movement that we're dealing with here. Okay, it goes on to state here that the movement itself, according to one historian, was so varied and comprehensive it almost defies definition, right? How in fact do you define progressivism? Since it's not a political party itself, but more of a movement, it may not necessarily fit into a nice, clean definition. But what we can have are some characteristics of the progressive movement. It says those labeled as progressives had a number of goals, and they largely railed against social injustice, right? If there's social injustice going on, such as poor working conditions and child labor, they're going to be about fixing those problems, right? They were about dealing with abuses by urban political bosses and corporate robber barons, right? Corporate capitalism run amok. They want to deal with those problems, okay? Some things that progressives sought to do was, one, they wanted greater democracy, and they wanted greater checks and balances. And again, the extension of democracy occurs under the progressives as women are granted the right to vote, right? So democracy, in fact, is spread under the progressive movement, and because the government is taking a much larger, more active role in regulating business, checks and balances also become more prominent. Okay, they wanted honest and efficient and larger government, and they wanted to see larger government in all areas, federal, state, and local. They wanted effective and continual regulation of big business, okay? Don't let free market capitalism run amok, right? Don't let the market necessarily regulate itself. The government should be able to regulate some of that. And they wanted greater social justice for the working poor, whom Jacob Riis might refer to again as the other half. It says in order to accomplish these goals, progressives looked to strengthen local, state, and federal governments because they saw government as the agent of human welfare and human reform. Now, again, you may not agree with that, and you may, okay? But this sort of hopefully helps to explain why in today's society the government may have this sense that it is their responsibility to a degree to act as the agent of human welfare, right? It comes out of this progressive period, okay? Okay, let's move on. All right, it says, underlying this new era of reform was a fundamental shift in philosophy. And this philosophy moved away from social Darwinism, right? The survival of the fittest, right? Let's recall what we talked about during the Gilded Age as far as why are some people wealthy and companies do well and why are others not, okay? Progressives moved away from those sort of ways of thinking. It says, why accept hardship and suffering as simply the result of natural selection, right? That's a question that progressives might have asked. It says humans can and have adapted their physical environments to suit their own purposes. Individuals need not accept injustice as the law of nature if they can think of a better way of dealing with it. So don't just accept the fact that, Rockefeller is naturally inclined to be successful and others are not, right? There's a way to adapt to the situation at hand, right? We don't just have to accept social injustice. We don't just have to accept that urban bosses of capitalism, right, run their companies in certain ways, and those who work for them just have to put up with whatever nonsense they might have to experience, right? There's better ways to deal with this. And so the progressives have a shift in ideology. It says philosopher William James called this new way of thinking pragmatism. His followers came to believe that an activist government could be the agent of the public to pursue the betterment of social ills, right? And that's one of the things that progressives are huge about, is nailing social evils. It says the most prolific disciple of James was one named John Dewey. Dewey applied pragmatic thinking to education. Okay? Rather than having students memorize facts or formulas, Dewey proposed learning by doing. The progressive education movement begun by Dewey dominated educational debate during the entire 20th century. And this is just an example of the application of pragmatism, progressivism, right, to areas of society where before people just accepted things the way they went. Now we can make changes, okay? We can be the agent. And by we, I mean the government can be the agent, right? And today we see that particularly, we can take education again as an example, right? There is a Department of Education at the federal level, okay? And the federal government has a huge hand in shaping the education of this nation. So, without hoping to digress more, let's just go ahead and move forward. It goes on to state here that the populist movement also influenced progressivism. Okay, it says, while rejecting the call for free silver, the progressives embraced the political reforms of the secret ballot. Okay, in other words, one of the things that progressives wanted to do politically was to allow people to vote in the government secretly as opposed to in public, right? Because when you vote publicly, this could sway one's opinion. They wanted to have the initiative and the referendum and the recall. And I believe the last time the recall was used, particularly in California, was Governor Gray Davis was recalled. And this was a form of checks and balance on the local government level. And that was an example of the progressive platform being engaged. Okay? It says most of these reforms were on the state level. Under the governorship of Robert Lafayette, Wisconsin became a laboratory for many of these political reforms to see whether or not they could work. It goes on to state that the populist ideas of an income tax and direct election of senators, right? These became very popular among progressives. And so we passed the 16th and 17th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Okay, the 16th Amendment established the income tax, which I'm sure we all love, right? And 17 brought about the election of senators being elected directly by the people. For those of you who are not familiar, initially when the country was first created, senators were selected by the House of Representatives. So we, the people, would select the House of Representatives, and then a committee of the representatives would then select senators. Well, in order to have greater oversight, in order to give the people more control over who their senators were, we had to amend the Constitution to allow people to now vote for their senators, which you do every 2 years. A third of the Senate comes up for re-election. Okay? And again, these are all components of the progressive movement. It says reforms went further by trying to root out urban corruption by introducing new models of city government. The city commission and the city manager systems removed important decision-making from politicians and placed it in the hands of skilled technicians. The labor movement contributed the calls for workers' compensation and child labor regulation. Finally, progressivism came from so many sources from every region of America. The national frame of mind was fixed. Reform would occur. It was only a matter of how much and of what type. And there was great debate among progressives as to how they should address various corruptions and how they should reform society. And, you know, not all the progressives were on the same page, but the things we have been mentioning here are sort of things that they could come together on. So let's go ahead and move forward. It says here, the pen is sometimes mightier than the sword. It says it may be a cliche, but it was all too true for journalists at the turn of the century. The print revolution at the time enabled publications to increase their subscriptions dramatically. Now, this may seem a bit out of place, but progressives were fueled by groups of people known as muckrakers. Muckrakers would include people like Jacob Riis, who, if you recall, wrote the book How the Other Half Live, right? In Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Live, he's exposing a social ill. He's showing the world the horrible and dilapidated condition that many people are living in. And these muckrakers provided progressives fuel. Okay? In order for progressive politicians, in order for them to get policies passed, they needed the support of the people. And these muckrakers helped to expose to a large group of audience people in the United States these social problems that progressive politicians then could act upon and get changes made. It says, what appeared in print was now more powerful than ever. Writing to Congress in hopes of correcting abuses was slow and often produced zero results. Publishing a series of articles had a much more immediate impact, and when you could apply photographs, as Jacob Riis did, picture speaks 1,000 words, and that's also going to provide some motivation. It says, collectively called muckrakers, a brave cadre of reporters exposed injustices so grave they made the blood of the average American run cold. Okay? You know, if you don't know the social ills of the day, you can't fix them. And the muckrakers, you know, sort of without, you know, partnering with the progressives, partnered with the progressives to expose these social ills. And once people like Jacob Riis and Lincoln Steffens exposed the corruption and the problems that exist in the United States, people begin to clamor and call for changes. It says the first muckraker to strike was Lincoln Steffens. In 1902, he published an article in McClure's magazine called Tweed Days in St. Louis. Steffens exposed how city officials worked in league with big business to maintain power while corrupting the public treasury. And, you know, he exposes these problems. It says more and more articles followed, and soon Steffens published the collection as a book entitled The Sham of the Cities. Soon, public outcry demanded reform of city government and gave strength to the progressive ideas of a city commission or city manager system. Again, I'm not expecting you to necessarily recall all these specific things that these people say. The point is to get a general idea that muckrakers and progressives are attacking the problems created by the Gilded Age, the problems created by a laissez-faire government and large corporations run amok. Okay? The muckrakers provided the general American population with stories and images of the problems that progressives were trying to address. And with the muckrakers' help, progressives gained public support in order to address these problems. So that's why I bring them up. One specific muckraker I do want to talk about is Upton Sinclair. It says, perhaps no muckraker caused as great a stir as Upton Sinclair. An avowed socialist, Sinclair hoped to illustrate the horrible effects of capitalism on workers in the Chicago meatpacking industry. And you've probably heard of his book called The Jungle. And The Jungle had some horrific, descriptive images of the meatpacking industry, and Sinclair's objective was to promote socialism, and basically he was railing against free market capitalism, And his purpose in writing The Jungle is to say, hey, look at the horrible, dilapidated conditions that these workers are forced to work in this Chicago meatpacking industry. You know, socialistic policies would not allow for these types of things to occur. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending upon your point of view, the jungle did not result in us moving towards socialism. What it did do was it upset Teddy Roosevelt and others, and eventually what gets passed, as you can see here down in red, is that the Food and Drug, or the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, gets passed in order to regulate the meatpacking industry. So rather than abandon free market capitalism, we simply begin to regulate free market capitalism, right? It says his bone-chilling account, The Jungle, detailed workers sacrificing their fingers and nails by working with acid, losing limbs, catching diseases, and toiling long hours in cold, cramped conditions. He hoped the public outcry would be so fierce that reforms would soon follow. Not necessarily regulation, but reform. Reform politically. It says the clamor that rang throughout America was not, however, a response to the workers' plight. Sinclair also uncovered the contents of the products being sold to the general public. It says spoiled meat was covered with chemicals to hide the smell. Skin, hair, stomach, ears, and nose were ground up and packaged as head cheese. Rats climbed over warehouse meat, leaving piles of excrement behind. These are the things that Sinclair is writing about. Okay? And again, Sinclair's objective is to bring about political reform, right? Political reform would correct these problems, but regulation of the corporation itself would also bring about changes. Let me read to you a bit about what was in his book. He writes, and I'm quoting from Tyndall, but Tyndall's quoting the book The Jungle, and it says, quote, "It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together." He goes on to state that we saw meat shoveled from filthy wooden floors, piled on tables rarely washed, pushed from room to room in rotten box carts, in all of which process it was in the way of gathering dirt, splinters, floor filth, and the expectorium of tuberculosis and other diseased workers, right? And so Sinclair, a muckraker, is exposing the evils of the meatpacking industry, and the response of the progressives was to regulate that industry. And this is just one example. Many corporations and companies were regulated as a result of progressive achievements. Okay, moving on. Goes on to state that progressive reforms attempted also to deal with social injustices, not just regulation of corporations. It says one of the most notorious of injustices was the horrid conditions of child labor and hazardous working environments. It says by 1904, the National Child Labor Committee was organized and sought to end the use of child labor through the passing of legislation at both state and national levels. And of course, for those of you that have a job, you know that there are regulations about, you know, how old you have to be in order to get a job. There's laws that regulate breaks and how many breaks you're supposed to have, you know, pending how long you're working. You have 8-hour work days. If you work longer than that, you have to be compensated, right? All of the laws that we have regulating labor today, as well as labor unions, come from this progressive movement, right? It says using forums and pictures from photographer Louis W. Hine, and I'm going to show you some of these. The NCLC, or the National Child Labor Committee, within 10 years had exposed the ills of child labor and had successfully encouraged most states to pass legislation banning the use of children as laborers. Okay? At this point, there is no age limit of how young a person could be, you know, working in a job. There is no regulation as to how long they should be working for or for how many days they should be working for, right? The conditions that they're working in are hazardous. They're put into you know, jobs like coal mining and things that are really dangerous. And so the NCLC and others are going to try and rectify these social ills. It says that the age at which children could work varied from state to state, but it ranged anywhere from 12 to 16 years of age. And I think today you can get a worker's permit with your parents' approval at the age of 15 and a half or something, and then you could work at 16. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but again, a lot of what we have today comes from from this movement. So I want to show you some of the pictures from Lewis W. Hine so you can sort of get a sense of what people were seeing. And your own reaction to it is probably not dissimilar to the reaction of many progressives who look at these photographs and were horrified by them. So let's take some time to take a look at some of these. Okay, so this is the first picture from Hine that we're going to take a look at, and I don't necessarily have specific things to say about each photograph, but the idea behind you looking at these is just to get a sense of what it must have felt like and what it must have been like for people viewing these photographs and the impact that must have had, right? So what you're seeing here is a young boy, difficult to say exactly how old he is. I submit probably somewhere between 12 to 14 years of age, perhaps a little bit older maybe, but one of the things that we definitely can tell from this photograph is that he's working what I believe to be is in a coal mines. He's wearing a hat which on the top could be lit so that you could see, but it would have been a very dangerous job, and these particular jobs would have been both dangerous and they would have been used, the job would have been beneficial for a small child because those kids could get into those tiny spaces. And again, the point that we're seeing here, the point that the artist is making is similar to what Jacob Riis did with How the Other Half Lives. This is a social problem. We have young children who are doing adult jobs, are being aged long beyond the years that they ought to be, and they're being worked long hours in dangerous conditions, hazardous conditions, and this needs to be rectified. And progressives are going to see images like this, right? And the public is going to see images like this, and they're going to throw their support further to the cause to fixing these problems. Let's go ahead and take a look at the other three photographs, and again, just spend some time looking at them. I'm not going to say much about them other than to just do a basic description of what's inside the photo. Okay, let's move on. This photo tends to get a few chuckles from students just because here you have, a bunch of young children, maybe 9, 10, 11 at the most, acting like little thugs, But the point is, again, is young kids are being forced to grow up. They're acting in ways that children should not have to act. Interestingly, around this time, one of the arguments against child labor is that children, let me rephrase this, it's not so much an argument against child labor, it's just a reality that's beginning to shift. Children had economic value in the 19th century in a way that they don't have in the 20th and 21st century. Okay? Today, children have sentimental value, right? This isn't to suggest that children didn't have sentimental value in the 19th century, but given the reality of birth and death rates, children tended to have less sentimental value and they tended to have more economic value, and child labor definitely forwarded this idea of children having an economic worth. That begins to change around the 19th century in the progressive movement, and so when you see an image like this where kids are being forced to act and grow older than they should be, it's shocking. So again, you can come back and take a look at this photograph, but I'm going to move on. Alright, what we have here is a young woman, young girl, young woman in the background, young girl in the front, working in a textile factory, the loom, a dangerous, hazardous place to work. No stools here, very little lighting, and again, here she is, not dressed well, doesn't look like she's very content or happy with her job, and again, who knows how long she's being forced to work. 7 days a week, 14 hours a day for very little pay. So again, just more photographs. Alright, finally, here we see just more images of child labor. And child labor is definitely one of the main social injustices that the progressives are going to try to fight against. So, in a nutshell, that is the progressive era. During this time, there is also another movement going on that I want to briefly talk about, and that is the women's movement. And so let me briefly deal with that, and then we we'll finish up for the day. All right, women's suffrage. Suffrage meaning the right to vote. All right. It says, after the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, which demanded women's suffrage for the first time, America became distracted by the coming Civil War, and then the issue of the vote resurfaced during Reconstruction, which we've talked about and mentioned a couple times. In fact, the women's rights movement was actually born out of the anti-slavery or abolitionist movement. Many women likened themselves to being slaves, that they were slaves to marriage, slaves to their husbands, and if there's to be an abrogation of slavery, so there should be a freedom for women. And there is a complicated and deep history that goes with this, but I don't have time to get into it. But just recognize that the women's suffrage movement, the desire for suffrage, for the right to vote, that particular call becomes, I believe, more paramount in the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And of course, during the Progressive era, you will see the passage of the 19th Amendment, which guarantees the women the right to vote. It goes on to state here that the 15th Amendment to the Constitution proposed granting the right to vote to African American males. Many female suffragettes at the time were outraged, right? And in fact, many women who were fighting predominantly for the anti-slavery cause, who were looking for equality of the races, found in the 15th Amendment sort of a backhand to the face, in that here we're going to, gain a victory for the African American, but it is not a victory for women, because only men are able to vote as a recourse of the 15th Amendment. It says they simply could not believe that those who suffered 350 years of bondage would be enfranchised before they were, right? And so there's a bit of racial tension that does go along with this. It goes on to state that activists such as Frederick Douglass, Lucy Stone, and Henry Blackwell argued that the 1860s was the time for the black male. Linking black suffrage with female suffrage would surely accomplish neither. In fact, there were many individuals early on in the early 1830s and at the turn of the century during the Progressive era that, when you are linking various reform movements together, some people seem to view this as problematic. You might gain headway in the anti-slavery cause, some argued, if you simply abandoned the call for women's rights as well. And that's sort of what's coming along here with the 15th Amendment. And you have a number of individuals, names that are very popular and well known with the women's movement. Named them here: Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, right? Who are basically going to push the boundaries of what it means to be both a woman and, for Sojourner Truth, a black woman. Okay, and these women, as it says here, disagreed. They would accept nothing less than immediate federal action supporting the vote for women. And unfortunately, the right for women to vote didn't come with the 15th Amendment. That's going to require an additional amendment later on. Okay, let's move forward. It says Stone and Blackwell formed the American Women's Suffrage Association and believed that pressuring state governments was the most effective way to accomplish their objectives. Anthony and Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association and pressed for a constitutional amendment. And so these women will split over how to obtain their particular objectives. Okay. It says this split occurred in 1869 and weakened the suffrage movement for the next 2 decades. Moving forward, it says Anthony and Stanton engaged in high-profile, headline-grabbing tactics. The NWSA was known to show up to the polls on Election Day to force officials to turn them away. They set up mock ballot boxes near the election sites so women could vote in protest. They continued to accept no compromise on a national amendment eliminating the gender requirement for voting. Now, I will say this. One of the things, and I don't know, and I would argue that it's probably not one of the more significant reasons why women didn't gain the right to vote as sooner than they did, but there was a fear that women as a collective group, if they were given the right to vote, would vote all the same way. Now, of course, that's a really ridiculous thing to say in today's society, because we know that women have varying opinions and they have varying positions. But at the turn of the century, there was this fear that women have sort of a collective objective for equality, and thus if you granted them the right to vote, they would always vote similarly. And enfranchising millions of women to vote, and if in fact they voted collectively, that could sway and change policy significantly. So it's just something to think about, and perhaps is a force as to why male legislators didn't more quickly grant women suffrage. It goes on to state here that the AWSA, the American Women's Suffrage Association, chose a much more understated path. Stone and Blackwell actively lobbied state governments. Wyoming became the first state to grant full women's suffrage in 1869, and Utah followed suit the following year, but then it stopped. No other states granted full suffrage until the 1890s, and then of course it wouldn't be until 1920 that the 19th Amendment would be passed, granting all women the right to vote, based both on gender and race. Okay, moving on. Alright, finally it says, by 1910, most states west of Mississippi had granted full suffrage rights to women. States of the Midwest, at least, permitted women to vote in presidential elections, but the Northeast and the South were steadfast in their opposition. It says, amid the backdrop of the United States entry into World War I, success finally came. In 1917, New York and Arkansas permitted women to vote, and momentum shifted toward suffrage. The NAWSA supported the war effort throughout the ratification process, and the prominent positions women held no doubt resulted in increased support. Finally, on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment became the supreme law of the land, and the long struggle for voting rights was over. Because at this point, the United States had become more democratic than it had ever been, because the entire population could now vote. But the women's rights movement here doesn't end, right? You're going to see what we call second wave feminism occur in the 1960s and 70s. We'll deal with that a little bit later on. But the one thing that we can say about this in its relation to progressivism is that it evidences the type of objectives that the progressives were trying to achieve, right? Greater democracy, greater participation, greater political intervention, right? Here we see that with the extension of women's suffrage in the 1920s. So we've covered quite a bit today, and so I'm going to leave it off here. But very important information, and hopefully you enjoyed it. So with that, go in peace, be warm and filled, and may the force be with you.